Well, welcome again to another session of the 17th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment Virtual Conference. I'm Bob Ailes, and you're stuck with me as the moderator. We have with us Randy Jenner, who has a doctorate uh, and is an educational designer slash developer and education researcher, working at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA. Ooh, very good. Randy's areas of expertise include educational and faculty development, pedagogy, qualitative research methods, assessment and educational measurement, and instructional and learning experience design. Might have been easier to say what you don't do, right? So, Randy, let me turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. So, I'm Dr. Brandy Jenner, as mentioned. I'm currently at UCLA Anderson School of Management. So, you'll see a tiny bit of a business flavor to my presentation today. Not a ton, but a little bit, a little hint here and there. So, today I really want to speak both about creating tasks that lead to high level learning and also to kind of think through what this new era that we've all entered means for our taxonomies of learning, for our heuristics, for the things that we use when we're trying to create these learning tasks, when we're trying to make new courses, new assignments for students. In many ways, I'm as new to this as you are, so I hope that you'll help me think through and around these issues. Feel free to participate via chat, raise your hand, and hopefully there'll be some time for questions at the end and we can discuss a little bit. In terms of the agenda, let me see if I can advance. Yeah, there we go. In terms of our agenda today, oh, no, that's the next slide. We'll be talking a little bit about Gen AI basics. We'll be talking mostly about the top of Bloom's taxonomy. If you see the triangle visualization, we'll be looking at the top of the triangle: synthesis, creation, and evaluation. We're going to talk about something I call human discernment, and I'm going to leave you with a thought activity because I think that's important. Our learning outcomes for today are sort of, they're a bit concrete, even though we're sort of up in the ether, really thinking through some of these things. We'll learn to differentiate between creation, evaluation, and synthesis as conceived of within Bloom's taxonomy. We'll think critically about how Gen AI is changing the landscape of learning and how, in that new landscape, we can create meaningful learning experiences. And we will look at how to practically create some assignments, create and improve some assignments, tasks, and questions so that they require human discernment in addition to AI use. So I know that we've had a couple of presentations about AI previously. I don't think anyone's as new to this as we all were a year ago, for example. But I'll briefly give you a little bit about AI. I put a friendly robot there. I always tell the story. I was chatting with my mom, and we're talking about the apocalypse as you do in these times. And I have one version of what it might be, maybe generationally, and my mom has a really different one. We talked about it, and she was like, "Yeah, it's definitely the robot apocalypse." And I was like, "Oh, interesting, huh? That is a very different view than what I have." So I think that there's sort of a lot of differences on how we think about what Gen AI means, what large language models sort of are and can do, and how that's going to impact society. So I think it's kind of a fun way, the apocalypse, but to frame the conversation, to sort of think around what it can do from the big to the small. You're probably familiar with a number of these engines on the screen right now: Google AI, Bing or Copilot, Microsoft Copilot now, ChatGPT, Dolly, Google Gemini, Bard, AI aggregators, things like Poe, or there's an AI for that. We are really proliferating right now. We're in that space where things are just sort of widening up. I assume that we'll go back down eventually, but who knows? We're sort of proliferating at the moment. Things that AI is good at, according to its makers and marketers, can be really anything. I've listed shop at the bottom because that is one thing that is very important to the makers of AI. So that's something that I always keep in the back of my mind, actually, is that These algorithms are harnessed for particular use. They're made really, they can improve our quality of life. They can do a lot of things for us, but there's also another side that we should just be really critical and really aware of, that especially with the proliferation of AI, people using them in sort of a marketing way will really increase. And I think that our need for critical thinking around AI will also increase as it becomes even more ubiquitous than it is today. So I won't read the list, but you can sort of see there are a lot of things that it's good at, quotidian things, right? Practical, everyday kinds of things. Make a workout for me, find a recipe for me. What should I pack on a trip? You can create multiple choice questions. Now, in my opinion, these aren't typically good multiple choice questions. You got to do some work, but there are a lot of things that you can do with AI from your personal life to your work life. I really view it as a spectrum, and I encourage the faculty members I work with when I'm teaching. I think of this. It's really a spectrum from low AI use to high AI use these days. There are few people who aren't using any AI, but if you use low AI, think of that as perhaps your students are using a Grammarly add-in for, Word, for Microsoft Word or something of that nature. Now that's AI use these days. There's an AI component to something like Grammarly. So that would be sort of low use. Maybe it's just running in the background a little bit. Maybe you only turn it on if you're working on a paper. Maybe that's a problem if you're an English teacher, right? To all the way to high A use, people who are actually going to ChatGPT, asking questions, really sort of brainstorming with it and trying to achieve deeper insights. So think of it as a spectrum. I think that helps. I'd like to encourage us to think about how we personally use AI, both you and then also your students. I'm in a role where I both teach and support faculty instructors. I use AI with my students in my class, as well as to prepare some materials for my course. I feel like I've got to give it a try if I'm going to be advising instructors about how they might use AI to prep their courses as well. Right now, I've noticed a lot of faculty are concerned with student AI use, even more than sort of becoming facile with it themselves. But they're really sort of interested in what students are doing with AI. Many are not sure. They think maybe students are doing everything with AI. So that's really where a lot of concern that I have encountered comes up. Of course, our concern today is really how to create these deep learning experiences that go beyond these basic tasks that can be done with AI. So my whole premise is that we can adjust our assignments to help students reach these deep levels of learning, rather than a process that is just go to the AI, ask it to accomplish a task, and stop there, right? So I encourage you as a thought experiment to think about how your students are using Gen AI. Feel free to share in the chat if you like. But this is really the question that keeps faculty up at night these days, whether they want to encourage or discourage that. So let's get back to blooms. This is my favorite, my personal favorite. There are many, many ways to represent Bloom's taxonomy. This is my favorite one. It's from our friends at Vanderbilt. And I think it's a really lovely representation. It uses sort of triangle. We're talking about the top pieces of that triangle there. And I think it gets really at the foundational nature of the taxonomy. I also really like that it includes verbs. I think that helps the taxonomy come to life. Most of us, when we're using Bloom's taxonomy, are really looking for those verbs. What will students be able to do? Ah, well, they'll be able to design. Ah, well, they'll be able to analyze. Ah, yes, they'll be able to recall, right? We're really sort of thinking about it in terms of these verbs at these different levels. And I think the differentiation between the levels is why Bloom's taxonomy really persists, why it's still interesting and still useful to folks. So I have a before and after here. Um, on the left, you'll find the original Bloom's taxonomy from 1956. Bloom's Taxonomy of Educational Objectives is the publication that that's in. And you can see here that evaluation is at the very top of the pyramid and that synthesis is the next one down. Now, there are some changes in the words, but that's sort of the main point that differs from the revised taxonomy on the right here, where create is at the top and evaluate is at the next level. So the revision happened in 2001. So there's a really substantial amount of time between the original and the revision. But a student of Bloom made the revision, in fact, with their students, obviously. And so this revision gives us some changes in emphasis for the taxonomy, as well as changes in terminology and structure, that flip flopping sort of the top. The knowledge subcategories were renamed and reorganized. Subcategories of the cognitive process categories were replaced by verbs. So it goes from knowledge to remember, right? And the process categories don't form a cumulative hierarchy. This was made really clear in the revision. Even though it's often thought of as being hierarchical, it's really more sort of foundational rather than hierarchical. Instead, subcategories are allowed to overlap. An example of this would be the verb explaining, which is a cognitive process listed within the understand sort of level on the right hand side, or you could think of comprehension on the left. But it can also be used in the apply category. So, asking a student to explain what the water cycle is, that would clearly be checking for understanding. But if you say, hey, for example, I have make a diagram explaining the water cycle, that would be somewhere between knowledge, somewhere between understand and apply. And then if you say, hey, explain to a friend about the water cycle, then you're heading all the way up really to the apply level. So you can see that there's a little bit of it's a little bit of room, a little bit of wiggle room on these categories. So let's get into the nitty gritty of the top of the taxonomy. And this part has a lot of nuance. I spent a lot of time sort of looking at the original and revised taxonomies and trying to tease this out because I think there's a lot there. And I think that a cursory glance, which was what most of us take at the taxonomy, is great and sufficient for most purposes. But I think these questions require us to dig in a little bit further. So Bloom defines evaluation as judgments about the value of material and methods for given purposes, right? It's quantitative and qualitative. It uses a standard of appraisal. The tasks associated with evaluation or judgment in terms of internal evidence and judgment in terms of external criteria. So you can see, all right, there's standard of appraisal there. There's something about valuing. It's really these types of tasks that come to mind when you think of evaluation. When you think of evaluation, that's exactly what evaluation, I think, really means. Tasks primarily related to judgment, appraising, questioning, defending, supporting, weighing arguments, right? It's really those type of tasks. I think evaluation is more straightforward than the other two categories that we'll talk about, synthesis and creation. And these tasks in the evaluation section really are generally tasks that highlight and benefit strongly from human discernment. I find tasks at the evaluation level, these verbs, to be really helpful when I'm crafting assignments that I think will sort of ask students to go that step further and not just go to an AI, whatever they choose, an aggregator, an engine for an answer. However, as Bloom's taxonomy has been revised, the focus has shifted away from evaluation to creation. Remember, evaluation was at the top of the pyramid, and then it sort of moved to be second from the top with creation at the top. Though I'll argue that in the generative AI era, a revisiting of evaluation as the top of the taxonomy could prove fruitful. I think it does. So let's move to synthesis, which was the sort of second category in the original taxonomy, right? So from Bloom's original taxonomy, synthesis is really the putting together of parts to form a whole. It's the process of working with pieces, parts, and elements, and sort of arranging and combining them in a way as to constitute a pattern or structure not clearly there before. So things like remixing, recombination, all part and parcel of synthesis. Bloom suggests that synthesis is related to three tasks, or rather, that three tasks sort of make up synthesis. And that is production of a unique communication, production of a plan, and a derivation of a set of abstract relations. Again, this is where nuance really comes in. In Latin, if you think of it that way, synthesis is more like composing, taking existing sounds, creating something new by mixing them in a new way. So I find it helpful to sort of go to some of the roots of those words. Generative AI, unfortunately, seems to be particularly good at synthesis tasks. Unfortunate for us as educators trying to get students to do the heavy mental lifting on their own. So, thus, if I'm asking for synthesis in student assignments, which I would typically do with um, some frequency, my suggestions now are to either really highly scaffold the task such that different specific pieces are due, one at a time. Each revision is part of the process, it builds on itself. Or to make the task extremely broad and ask the student to memo or write and explain the choices that they make or the assumptions along the way. In terms of something like a literature review, which is a fairly regular task, I think, for higher level undergrads, for graduate students, I would ask students to focus on the insights gleaned from combing through a body of literature rather than just sort of laying out what each piece does, but really sort of thinking about them in conversation with each other or about combining two seemingly disparate bodies of literature, maybe that hadn't been combined in the literature before. Synthesis, as noted in the revised taxonomy, has been sort of rebranded as creativity. There's some nuances, but it remains mostly similar. We'll get into the differences next. So, creation, the new top of the revised Bloom's taxonomy from 2001. Really, according to the taxonomy, creation involves putting together elements to form a coherent or functional whole. Create includes both objectives that call for unique production and also calls for production that all students can and will do. And that is something that I spent a lot of time noodling on when I was thinking about this presentation and this talk. So unique production and then production that all students can and will do. There are a lot of different ways to create something. Creating something from a model one to one is also creation. Now, is that creation deserve to be at the top of Bloom's taxonomy, the top of this heuristic of learning experiences? Maybe, maybe not, right? Basically, Bloom acknowledges that you can't always ask students to create something entirely novel, which is fair, and counts production, synthesis, and generation all as parts of the creation level in the taxonomy. Bloom notes that many objectives in the create category don't rely solely on originality or uniqueness. The intent instead is that students should be able to synthesize material into a whole. And that's sort of where the similarities with the previous level of synthesis really come. But when I think of create as being the top of the taxonomy, I'll be honest, I think of it involving the construction of an original product, wherein students have to draw upon elements from many sources, put them together in a novel structure or pattern, at least relative to their own prior knowledge. If they didn't know about the wheel and they invent the wheel, that's still novel for them. It's not novel for society, but it's novel for them, and that's important. Bloom says that create results in new products, something that can be observed and that is more than the student's beginning material. So again, this idea of taking something, adding a little bit of their own personal spice to it and making something new, right? According to the revised taxonomy, the creative process can be thought of as starting with a divergent phase called generating, in which you think of a variety of solutions, followed by a convergent phase in which the solution is devised and turned into a plan of action. Then finally, a producing phase in which the plan is executed and students actually construct the solution, the final creation. In this way, creation involves generation, planning, and producing. So really we have, again, similar to synthesis, there are a number of tasks that are associated with creation. Again, unfortunately, Gen AI is particularly well suited to producing the generating phase of creation. One way that I often use Gen AI is as a brainstorming buddy. Sometimes I'll ask it questions or have it ask me questions. And even though it may not produce novel insight for me, sometimes it will get my creative juices flowing such that I'm able to produce the answer that I was looking for rather than it. So when we think about that, as creation and generation become easier and quicker with the help of technology, that's even more impetus to examine our courses and ask ourselves what's really important for our students to be able to do at the end of their time with us. The very thing that Bloom's taxonomy is supposed to help educators with, right? Then the trick for us is to get students to make visible the work of the second two parts of creation, that planning and solving. If generation can be done by a machine, okay, great. How do we make the whole process visible, particularly those last two pieces? Professor Ethan Mollick from UPenn's Wharton Business School says, to be clear, there's no definition of creativity that's singular, but researchers have developed a number of flawed tests that are widely used to measure the ability of humans to come up with diverse and meaningful ideas. The fact that these tests were flawed wasn't a big deal until suddenly AI were able to pass all of them. And I think that really gets to the heart of the matter, is defining what creativity truly looks like. Based on recent research with AI, generative AI can generate creative ideas in real life practical situations. It can also help people generate better ideas themselves as a thought partner or brainstorm engine, as I mentioned. The ideas that AI generates are better than what the average person can come up with, according to this research. But very creative people will beat the AI every time, is kind of what's suggested currently. The other thing to note is that there's more underlying similarity to the ideas that our current generation, at least, of AIs produce than among ideas generated by a larger number of humans. So AI ideas are more similar to AI ideas. If you ask Bard, Gemini, Bing, ChatGPT, the ideas it generates will be more similar to each other than if you got a group of humans in a room and said, hey, we're thinking of novel ideas. It's brainstorming time. Let's go. And I think that that is something that I remember. It's something that's really useful to us as educators when we're thinking about what AI can do and what it can't do. And it's useful for us to explicitly share with students that the AI is a good brainstorming engine, but it tends not to be the most creative thing. So, for example, if we're using it in a business context to come up with novel, really interesting business ideas, it's probably not going to come up with the most interesting or creative sort of pieces there. One question, or my 2 cents, is that it's actually really hard to measure novel creativity in a test. So many of the tests that we have actually measure synthesis rather than creation, which I think is probably related to why the old top of the pyramid in Bloom's used to be synthesis and now it's creation, right? We understood that synthesis was maybe a little bit easier. Maybe it's something that required something different, if not easier. I guess I shouldn't say easier. That sort of makes it hierarchical, but it requires something a little bit different. That there's something between synthesis and creation. They're not part and parcel of the same thing. There's space between them, and our job, my job, is really to tease out what that special something is. One of the questions that has come to mind for me with regard to creativity are questions of aesthetics, right? Is something beautiful? Is it art? Is it good art? Similarly, the classic humanities question, what is good or what is the good, is a really helpful question. Those are difficult questions for humans at the best of times. There's a lot of reasonable disagreement about how to answer them and what constitutes a great answer to those questions. Hence, it's not a good candidate for AI use. So that makes it a great candidate for our classrooms. A really interesting article came out about a year ago in the Harvard Business Review. In it, the authors talk about something they call authentic intelligence, which is what humans represent. Humans have this authentic intelligence. And they assert that it's complementary to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, they say, can combine with authentic intelligence to produce something they call augmented intelligence. So that's the combination of humans and computers essentially together. Like human teams, the authors assert that the power of working with an AI comes from how the person and computer complement each other. And I think that that's something that we can really keep in mind, and that we can make sure that students also know about. My favorite quote from the article is this: contrary to AI abilities that are only responsive to the data available, humans have the ability to imagine, anticipate, feel, and judge changing situations, which allows them to shift from short term to long term concerns. These abilities are unique to humans at the present moment, and do not require a steady flow of externally provided data to work, as is the case with artificial intelligence. So I think that's something for us to ponder. And if the name Gary Kasparov on the slide, one of the article authors, is familiar to you, it's because he was the first human chess grandmaster to lose to a supercomputer called Deep Blue. He's since begun collaborating with computers in chess matches. So I think that's a very interesting sort of parable for how we can consider. Some of us feel beaten by AI right now, particularly in classrooms. But instead, if we shift our perspective and begin sort of thinking about how we can complement each other, that's really where the gold is, right? So then, how do we get students to work with AI in a way that results in augmented intelligence rather than just relying solely on the machine? I postulate that we need to create tasks that require human discernment to force this partnership. So within our Bloom's taxonomy, we can actually pick out some verbs that are particularly useful. I'm going to go to the next slide, and if you feel like it, feel free to take a picture. You can do whatever you want with it. This is my subset of the verbs that I've identified at each level that seem to require or lend themselves to some form of human discernment or choice or claim that we can ask students to explain their reasoning or talk through within a task. So you can see I've got something at every level. Shout out to a colleague in a previous talk that I've given at the remember level. I didn't find any verbs that jumped out to me initially at this bottom level of the taxonomy, at the most foundational. And this colleague was sort of letting me know about the possibility of reminiscing. So like, tell me a story about a time when, reminisce with me. And I think that that's a good candidate. I'm not fully sold on it, but I think it's a really good candidate. And I think its use would be discipline specific potentially. But you can see that questioning is at the heart of many of these verbs and the tasks that they lend themselves to, right? You can think of interpret, judge, imagine, modify, conjecture, play, consider, right? Infer, all of these types of things. Bloom talks about how students will answer questions in the taxonomy. We're talking about verbs here, but sheds less insight on how students will ask questions. I always think that the should question, should we do something? Should this person do that? Should we as a society, blah, 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 is a really productive question. It's a good example of what we can ask students, similar to the questions of aesthetics and humanities cited previously. For example, in economics, we used to ask questions that listed all of the constraints and assumptions and ask students to solve within that set. In the ChatGPT era, we might ask a similar question, but give less information. Ask them to detail their own assumptions and constraint numbers. Then ask them if, given those assumptions and constraints, they would or should make a particular choice, like starting a business. Shout out to my colleague, Nico Voigtlander at UCLA's Anderson School of Management for that idea. A question for all of you pedagogy nerds. Where is the verb questioning? We can see this list. Really interesting. A lot of great verbs there. There's no verb that's question. And I've looked at a lot of taxonomies, a lot that contain verbs. I haven't found a single place that people place the verb questioning. And Bloom's taxonomy, original and revised, certainly don't. Critical thinking and problem solving as specific words or discrete tasks in the taxonomies were initially excluded because they tended to, quote, cut across rows and columns of the taxonomy table. So we can think of critical thinking across all tasks. We can think of questioning across tasks. This is the point. That's what I'll move into next. But this is the point where I will ask anyone in chat if they don't see their favorite verb on the list. This is, of course, my conjecture, my research. So it may not jive with what you're experiencing in the classroom or in your research. So feel free to add something to the list. I love that. In terms of questioning, we have some great examples from folks who are using Bloom's taxonomy for practice, who are really thinking about questioning. A great example is Barbara Gross Davis's Tools for Teaching. You can see here examples of questions that she gives at all of the different levels of Bloom's. So again, lower levels of knowledge skills and comprehension skills tend to be less useful to us in the new era of education. But application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, these sample questions can be altered. They're productive starting points. For example, the application level question shown here, perhaps instead of, how would you analyze the data, you could say something like, well, state which you would pick, what would be perfect for a specific case. You can sort of modify it. You can add a little bit. You could say, give a couple examples. The other levels would need similar readjustments to continue to ask students to really justify and make their choices. That again, that making choices, justifying choices, and adding just a little word here or there tends to really help some of these classic examples. I also have some good examples from Bloom's taxonomy and its use in classroom assessment by Alison Cullinane. So similar to the previous slide, the higher level questions would be more useful in creating high value learning experiences, but they may still need to be altered. One productive way to emphasize questioning is to flip the script and to ask students to come up with their own questions. Again, this really helps us move up Bloom's taxonomy levels in our classroom work. I particularly like this analysis level question shown here because it asks students to tailor their question to a location. So I'll read it. The analysis level question here is compare and contrast the various types of lichens you've found from the individual locations you've studied. Why do you think there might be a difference in the occurrence of the lichens in these locations? So ChatGPT doesn't know that, right? That's something that your student has to conjecture. Now, ChatGPT can coach your student about what factors might influence lichen growth in different locations, but the students will have to see sort of what makes sense for their context, what's at play in their location. And that really helps us. That brings that discernment in. It brings the human back in for that augmented intelligence. There's a lot of research in the genre of sort of categorizing multiple choice questions or other types of test questions according to Bloom's taxonomy. What I've read there is that the takeaway is really that most questions we ask are related to low levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And that research sort of doesn't go a lot further. They say, oh, well, maybe we can move it up to the apply level. There's also a lot in the literature that sort of describes how to write questions that assess higher order learning, and an argument that this can indeed be done, right? But what I find lacking from the literature around teaching students is around teaching students to formulate excellent questions. So we're not teaching them to question as much as is now really required when we have something like ChatGPT, which we can prompt, we can ask it a question, we can use it to help us solve a task, but only if we phrase that task in a way that it can help us actually come up with a useful answer. So that's where human discernment comes in. Now, as a note, I do think there's at least a philosophical difference between true novel creation tasks like synthesis, generation, theory extension, recombination, remixing in art or music. However, practically speaking, a lot of what we see or experience as a novel is really just a remix. Within this, I think it's still up to humans to decide what to synthesize, productively extend, remix in just which location, and so on. Which brings us back to discernment. So it reminds us that we need to ask students to evaluate, explain, or justify their work. In this new era, we can never ask students to simply present a solution. That's really no longer going to be adequate pedagogy. Unfortunately, we're going to have to alter things. We're going to have to say, I had this prompt that asks you to solve, and now the solution is actually a little bit less important than the process or what you make of it or the next steps that you might sort of think of. So, what can we do practically then? So this brings me to a little section on improving our prompts, which is, I think, where we need to go next. And when I'm saying our prompts here, that means our assignment prompts to students. So in this existing prompt, we're asking around ethical concerns and archaeological research. I think it's a pretty good prompt. It's asking for a reflection paper, applying multiple ethical perspectives to the treatment of human remains and archaeology, all of that. It's not a bad prompt, but if you stick it into an engine like ChatGPT, it can come up with a response fairly quickly. One of the things that kind of works against us is that we, as educators, as instructors, have spent a lot of time trying to craft really clear prompts for students that give them all the information. And that's great work for us, but that's something that we may need to change a little bit. We need to dial back, as heard in the economics example earlier. So if I was to alter this prompt, I would do it in a couple of ways. I would say, okay, not just any ethical perspective, but one of the four ethical perspectives offered by the studies in our class text, right? Or that, we went through in our course. And then I would finish it up with saying throughout the paper, draw connections to the topics and perspectives brought up in our class discussion, maybe on a particular date, to really sort of make it something that the students need to do, that they need to force the partnership with the machine. They can't just go to the machine for the answer. It's not going to be sufficient given these new constraints. So we have to force students to do their own thinking sometimes. And that can seem a little dystopic, I know. But especially, I deal mostly with graduate students. Many are really busy. And from business perspective, it certainly makes sense for them to do things as quickly as possible. But from a learning perspective, it doesn't. And that's our perspective. We really care about the learning perspective. And so that's what we have to bring back to students. We have to say, remember, these are not simply tasks that's one and done. Wham, bam, it's done, right? That's not the kind of tasks that we're doing. That's not the endeavor of education. Instead, we are trying to get your mind to work. We're trying to get your mind to work on established theories, frameworks in the field. We're trying to get you to do the work of practice. And we're trying to change your brain. And that doesn't happen if you just go to a computer for an answer. A second prompt, I would sort of change similarly. Again, it's another essay, but this time it's an annotated bibliography. So, you sort of state synopsis should contain 12 sources, each annotation should, blah, 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 right? So, if we were to improve this prompt, I would say in this case, you could make it more specific. So, you could say, explain the major conversations happening within the topic. ChatGPT may or may not be able to source that. It would probably give students a few examples, and then it would be up to the students to pick the ones that they think are most germane. Saying the synopsis should require the following: a description of the topic, an overview of your personal research questions and how they've developed over the course of your research so far, something that ChatGPT can't really help with. A summary of the way scholars tend to approach the topic, and a summary of the way non-scholars tend to approach the topic. That's something that again gives a little bit more clarity to students to get their brain working from different perspectives. And then below, not just summarizing a source in an annotated bibliography, but explaining how that source was useful to the student, what it taught them about their topic, what key words it introduced you to, right? What was new for them? That will be different student to student. Other sources it provided, how did they mine the bibliography of that source to get to other sources, if relevant, account for flaws and limitations. So really sort of asking, there are two schools, right? One is being more vague and the other is asking students to do more work. And both are actually really good strategies for working with AI. Those sort of simple solve it tasks just don't work. You can make it broad, invent your own problem, solve it. Or you can make it really specific. How is it useful to you in this moment from this? How does it relate to our class discussions? So those are some of the pieces. At the end of the day, we're trying to work with AI, not against it. A lot of my faculty have some fear around working with AI and want to really strongly constrain what students are doing with it. I definitely understand that perspective in some courses, but again, especially because I work with graduate faculty, with graduate students to student faculty teaching graduate students. Um, that's kind of not what we're looking for. We're looking to train people who are going to go out into the workforce, and people are going to be able to use AI in their everyday lives. And sometimes it's really useful and sometimes it's really not. So, what I would say is ask students to think about how they prompt AI to yield better conclusions. So, ask them to give you, as the instructor, an initial prompt and then a memo saying how they refine the prompt if they're using AI. It's not a problem. How can they explain what they're struggling with to AI to get that better answer? What are the most illustrative examples that they can use with the AI? Have the AI provide options for brainstorming. I think the best use for AI for me that I have done is as a brainstorming partner because it really helps get past my blocks in writing. It really helps me because I often will see the answer it gives and say, "Oh God, I don't like that. That doesn't work at all." But that gets me closer to what will work, and I think particularly in writing courses, that's really helpful. Right? It moves the process forward. Have the AI analyze the data to identify insights, but then ask the students to select the most meaningful points, justify that answer. Ask the AI to ask the students questions to drive their insight. What questions would ChatGPT ask it? What questions would ChatGPT ask you about that topic to move you forward? Have the students memo about their experience, have them tell you about it. Also, try this. Tell students that they can choose which assignments they can use AI on, but tell them that you'll only accept AI on a certain number of assignments. You get to use AI on 5 assignments this term, and then they have to specify why they made their choices. I would be really remiss if I didn't mention the huge environmental and sustainability challenges and costs of AI use. Our society as it currently exists cannot sustain the environmental consequences of humans using AI for every little thing. In this way, discernment's also a sustainability imperative. We need to think about when Gen AI is really adding value and when it's just not. When I started using AI, I tried using it for every task. I used it so much. The advice was to try and use it for a lot of different things to see what the answers are. Now, I use AI much less. I use it for a few very specific tasks where it's a high value add. And for other tasks, it's just not a value to me. So, getting your students to sort of think about that discernment will move them forward. It will make their brains think and change. It will help them in practice in the fields that they go into. And one of my favorite little quotes, as Mr. Rogers reminds us, your imagination is far more wonderful than any computer could ever be. So I always try and remind myself that you've got stuff inside your brain that is better than what you can find on the internet, if you stop to think about it. And I think it's what we need sometimes to balance the perspective. In closing, I'm going to leave you with a thought activity because I think that's what we're all after, right? We're all after getting our brains working. We're all after thinking deeply about these topics. So, the activity that I'm going to leave you with is that I've talked a lot about Bloom's taxonomy, but Bloom's taxonomy isn't the only taxonomy or the only heuristic for learning. You can see here Fink's taxonomy of significant learning, which I think is really interesting and really different, potentially really complementary for Bloom's taxonomy, particularly left side. Trying to work out if it's flipped or not, particularly the left side. And there are others, Kirkpatrick's training model, if you're in a more practical practitioner discipline. So there are a lot of different heuristics, a lot of different taxonomies, a lot of different tools, not just Bloom's, even though I adore Bloom's taxonomy. We could also think about reinventing Bloom's taxonomy or revising it again to incorporate the recent sea changes in learning. I'm curious, is it time for another revision? Do you think it still holds up? I'm undecided myself, but this presentation was really created because I wanted to look back at the original taxonomy and its revision and imagine beyond it into the future. Let's take our authentic intelligence and see if we can't come up with a taxonomy that results in learners accomplishing tasks with augmented intelligence. That's kind of the thought experiment that I will leave you with. The taxonomies here are Bloom's original and revised, Defink's taxonomy, significant learning. You can also look at the Kirkpatrick training model. Those are the three that I sort of found really useful when I was looking at this. But that's not all. That's not all that there are. So, could we create something new? Let me head to my last slide. So, our takeaways today. The takeaways are there's positives and minuses, positives and negatives, right? AI is good at doing a lot of things that look like the highest levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but the best pairing really requires this augmented intelligence, the partnership between human authentic intelligence and AI artificial intelligence, right? When creating assignments, we have to consider the highest level of verb being used. Are we looking at creation, generation, synthesis, evaluation? Which part of those tasks? We, as educators and folks who are creating assignments for students, need to get really specific with what we want our students to do. We need to get better at discernment to help them get better at discernment. We need to focus on adding more human discernment into the tasks, asking students to choose, justify, explain, revise. We can consider adding in things related to the human dimension from Fink's taxonomy, like caring or learning how to learn, and the change behavior and appraisal that results from the Kirkpatrick training model, which isn't pictured here because I couldn't find a view that I really loved of it, but is really worth looking up. Remember, we can build learning outcomes and assignments differently to achieve higher levels of learning. All right. Thank you so much. Awesome. Thank you so much in the chat. If you have questions, I think we do have a couple of minutes. And if not, I know you can head to your breaks. Thank you all. Oh, I'm so glad. I'm glad. I hope it's offered something new for you, Carolyn.
Well,
Awesome.
I think you're a hit.
Perfect. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad. I hope it's an interesting perspective. May not be entirely novel. It's hard to judge. But I hope it's useful.
Yeah, well, I think so. I think it spurred a lot of ideas in people's heads. That's what we want. So,
That's what we're looking for. Yeah, that's the business. Awesome. Well,
and
thank you so much.